In the name of Allah Almighty, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It is lecture number 13 of History of English Literature 1, Medieval to Romantics. And today the topic that we have to discuss is novelists and prose writers of early Victorian period. In previous class, we have discussed the poets of the early Victorian period, and before that, we have also discussed that which period is called as the early Victorian period. Alright, we are also done with the characteristics of this period, so I am quickly moving towards only the novelists and prose writers of early Victorian period. Yes, the content that we have to discuss in this lecture are introduction, first of all, types of novels, novelists of early Victorian period, minor novelists, then we have prose writers of early Victorian period, and at the end there is conclusion. Okay, starting with the introduction. In the early Victorian period, the novel made a rapid progress. Novel reading was one of the chief occupations of the educated public, and material had to be found for every taste. If we look back at the history, so we get to know that it was actually the early Victorian period in which the novel was, it became novel in real sense, that although there were pamphlets, there were, scripts that were being written before the Victorian period, but we cannot call it a true novel. And novel was, for the very first time, it actually became the genre of novel in this Victorian age. And when we talk about the early Victorian period, so it was one of the richest period of the novel in the history of English literature, because the novels of that period are widely read, and they are even famous till date, and many people know their names at least. And being a student of literature, we also read them in detail. So what happened? Novel reading was one of the chief occupations of the educated public, and material had to be found for every taste. So it was, chief occupations mean one of the main interest of the educated public. The public that was educated they were very interested in reading novels, and novels that were written at that time. And material had to be found for every taste, which means that there should be the material for the children, for the kids, there should be for the young, for the adults, and for the people of old age. So the result was that the scope of the novel, which during the 18th century dealt mainly with contemporary life and manners, was considerably enlarged. What happened in 18th century? The scope of the novel, it was restricted only to the contemporary, means the contemporary life and manners, the life and manners of that age. It was restricted only to that. But later on, its scope was enlarged. A number of brilliant novelists showed that it was possible to adapt the novel to almost all purposes of literature whatsoever. Adapt means to make adjustable. So they made novel adjustable to almost all purposes of literature, like all fields of literature. There was the novels being written on the domestic life, on politics, on social issues, on economy. So there were different categories of the novels. That is why it appeared, or it became a proper genre in literature. Types of novels that were produced, that were written at that time were political pamphlets. Okay, let's read it. The novels produced during the period took various shapes: sermons, political pamphlets, philosophical discourses, social essays, autobiographies, and poems in prose. So the novels that produced at that time, it had different shapes, but they were sermons, means the oral narration, or any kind of, the person who used to speak to the audience or to the large public, they were also written down in the form of the novels. Political means on some political topics, pamphlets in the form of, short leaflets, and which were distributed among public. Philosophical discourses means any written text. So philosophical text was also named as novel. Social essays, the essays that were written on some social issue, it can be any topic related to the society, and it was also considered as a novel. Autobiographies and poems in prose. Yes, autobiographies means writing the story of your own life. So those novelists who had written their own stories, the stories of their own lives, they were also considered as novels. Then poems in prose. Prose is basically the straightforward writing, while in poem, what is done is poems there's a difference of structure that poems are written in form of lyrics, in the form of it has meter and rhyme, it has specific structure, while when we talk about the prose it is just the straightforward writing as is done in the essay. So novelists of the novels of this time which were written which were actually the poems but they were written in the form of the prose, they were also considered as novels. Novelists of early Victorian period, there were two most important outstanding novelists of that time. They were Charles Dickens and Thackeray. Yes, we have the Charles Dickens. He was one of the most popular, and he is actually the one of the most popular novelist of all times. And his novels are read widely. They had been read while during his lifetime as well, and still you will also read his novels in your later classes. So he is that the big head in the field of novels. Dickens is the chief among the early Victorian novelists and is in fact the most popular of all English novelists so far. It was at the age of 25 with the publication of Pickwick Papers that Dickens suddenly sprang into fame and came to be regarded as the most popular of English novelists. He is, as I said earlier, he is the chief among the early Victorian novelists and he is the most popular of all the English novelists so far. Although we have other novelists like Thomas Hardy, we have, you know, George Eliot, Jane Austen, there's Emily Bronte, but he just stands out among all because his novels are have they can be related to all kinds of people. Like in his novel, we find the description of the rich as well as poor people. If he is basically the voice of the poor people of the society, like the first people belonging to the lower class. But at the same time, he also presents the psychological insight of the rich as well, that how which type of sufferings they had to face. All right. So it was at the age of 25 he published his novel that is Pickwick Papers, and then he suddenly became popular and famous, and he came to be regarded as the most popular of English. Okay, his most famous novels are Bleak House, A Tale of Two Cities. You might have heard this name. It is one of the most famous novels of Charles Dickens. There is Dorrit, Edwin Drood, David Copperfield. Okay, next we have William Makepeace Thackeray, 1811 to 1866. And Thackeray was Dickens' contemporary. Contemporary means of the same age, means both were of the same, both belong to the same era of literature. Like when Dickens was writing the novels, Thackeray was also writing at the same time, and a great rival for popular favor. So also he was a great rival. He also wanted to become as popular as Dickens was, lacked his weaknesses and genius. If we compare Thackeray with Dickens, we come to know that although they both have many qualities which are same, but Thackeray lacked his weaknesses and his genius. He was more interested in the manners and morals of the aristocracy than in the great upheavals of the age. As I said earlier, that Dickens used to write novels on such topics which related to the lower class of the society, while Thackeray was interested in reading and in presenting the aristocracy, means the upper class, the elite class of the society, instead of talking about the upheavals. Upheavals means unwanted changes that took place at that time. There were many political and social changes that took place, and I have also talked about them in my previous lectures. Unlike Dickens, who came of a poor family and had to struggle hard in his boyhood, Thackeray was born of rich parents, inherited a comfortable fortune, and spent his young days in comfort. If we talk about their family background, so Dickens was from poor family and he had to struggle hard as a boy, or you can say in his teenage. On the other hand, Thackeray was born of rich parents. He belonged to the aristocratic family. He was rich. As a result, he inherited a comfortable fortune and he spent his days in quite peacefully and comfortably. His novels include Vanity Fair. It was his first novel that published in 1846. Next, there is Henry Esmond and Pendennis, Newcomes, and The Virginians. Along with this, he also wrote other novels, but we have just we'll just look at only the most popular novels of Thackeray. There were other minor novelists as well at that time, which were not as popular as Dickens and Thackeray were, but they were still there, and there one or two famous are one or two novels are famous. For example, number one we have Benjamin Disraeli. He was also writing novels at that time. There is Charlotte Bronte, and you might have heard about Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is one of the most famous novels in English literature, and it was written by Charlotte Bronte. Then her sister, she is Emily Bronte. They were basically three sisters: Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Anne Bronte. So Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. All right. So and Anne Bronte, I guess, she wrote The Willet. All right. So they were Bronte sisters. They were named as Bronte sisters because the three sisters used to write novels, but Charlotte Bronte was famous of all. Emily Bronte was less famous, but still she was writing there. That is why we are considering her name. Mrs. Gaskell and Anthony Trollope. So they were the important and important minor novelists. Along with these, there were other novelists as well, but we will do only these five. Yes. Now moving toward the other part of the lecture, that is prose writers of the early Victorian period. So first of all, I would like to tell you people what is prose, as I have explained before as well. So just for the sake of repetition, I will say that prose is basically, it is a Latin word which means straightforward writing. So this is a writing which is written in the form of essay. For example, from the early Victorian prose till this economic change. This is what? It is basically a paragraph that is written. Alright, so if you start writing this paragraph in the form of poetry, having some rhyme scheme, having some rhythm, having some style, figurative language, so that will become a poem. While if you start writing it the way it is, like in the form of a paragraph, in the form of an essay, so it is called as prose. So Carlyle, the early Victorian prose is in keeping with the energetic temperament of the time, and expansive energy seems to be characteristics of the whole period. So if we talk about the early Victorian prose, so it was keeping with the energetic temperament of the time, because there was a lot of hustle going on, political, social, and philosophical things, they were discovering, and there was also scientific development. So that is why this prose has also kept pace with the energetic temperament of the time. And expansive energy seems to be characteristics of the whole period. Expansive energy, it means that there was, something like energy at high level. It seems to be the characteristics of the whole period, displaying itself as field in literature as a development of science, geographical exploration, and the rapidity of economic change. I also said it earlier that not only in literature the development was taking place, but it was because of the development in science, geographical exploration were taking place, and rapidity of economic change, that the literature flourished, because literary persons, literary poets and novelists and the prose writers, they got different topics and different subjects to discuss in their works. That is why this age is rich, and in this age, as the Queen Victoria also patronizes the literature. That is why the literature flourished. Carlyle's The French Revolution. John Carlyle wrote The French Revolution, Ruskin's Modern Painters. So Thomas Carlyle wrote The French Revolution, John Ruskin wrote Modern Painters, and Matthew Arnold wrote Essays in Criticism, which are not modest and light-hearted compositions, but they represent the aesthetic equivalence of self-assertion and will to survive, which was the characteristics of the early Victorian. So the writer says that they were not only these prose. The French Revolution is a prose by Thomas Carlyle. These prose writings, they were not just the mere compositions, and they were not only light-hearted, but they represented actually the appealing sense of self-assertion, that this is how they self-asserted, the poets, the novelists, and the prose writers, they asserted themselves, and they also presented their will to survive. Yes, this is what we want, this is the type of social change, this is the type of the political and economic change that we want in our society, and they had presented them in their novels. And it was the characteristics of the early Victorians. Let's discuss the prose writers of the early Victorian period one by one. First, we have Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle was the dominant figure of the Victorian period. He made his influence felt in every department of Victorian life. So he was a dominant figure. As I said, that Dickens was the master of novels, and he is the dominant figure in the history of English literature in the field of novels. So Thomas Carlyle is famous for his prose after um, Francis Bacon. Alright, so he made his influence felt in every department of Victorian life. In the general prose literature of his age, he was incomparably the greatest figure. And if we talk about the general prose literature, so he was the greatest figure and one of the greatest moral forces. In his youth, he suffered from doubt, which assailed him, which kept him move along some path. Him during the many dark years in which he wandered, howling wilderness of infidelity. Howling means shrieking, shouting wilderness. Wilderness means loneliness. Of infidelity means unfaithfulness. He did not have faith in the God in the dark years of his life, but later on he just recovered his lost belief in God. And what happened? So he wandered in howling wilderness of infidelity, then striving. He struggled hard vainly to recover his lost belief in God. Vainly means unsuccessfully. So he had strived to get the lost belief in God, but could not do so. Okay, his works include French Revolution, Heroes and Hero Worship, Past and Present, Letters and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell. So these are the important works or the prose writings of Thomas Carlyle. Next, we have John Ruskin. From 1819 to 1900, it is his year of birth, and that is year of death. The general prose literature of the early Victorian period, Ruskin is ranked next to Carlyle. Yes, since he's next to Carlyle, that is why I have put his name on the second number in this explaining. So, if we talk about the general prose literature of that time, Ruskin is next to Carlyle. Of all the Victorian writers who were conscious of the defeats in contemporary life, he expressed himself most voluminously. Voluminously means writing large stories, large text containing many pages. Alright, so they were, of all the Victorian writers that who were conscious that they were not going to be successful in this contemporary life, because there were a lot of other writers who were writing. So he has adopted a different style that he wrote in a huge bulk, that if anything could have been said on 2 pages, so he used 5 to 6 pages in order to explain only one thing. So that was his style. Okay, his works include Modern Painters, The Seven Lamps of Architecture, The Stone of Venice, Unto This Last, The Crown of Wild Olive. So mostly he had written on the topics of history. Next we have Thomas Babington Lord Macaulay. You might have heard his name, that Thomas Macaulay. So though Carlyle and Ruskin are now considered to be the great prose writers of the Victorian period, contemporary opinion gave the first place to Macaulay, who in popularity far exceeded both of them. Although Carlyle and Ruskin, they are considered the greatest prose writers of the Victorian period, but now people, when they have read about in detail the Macaulay's work, so they say that in popularity, Macaulay is way more, way more famous than Carlyle and Ruskin, and also his work is yet, of more quality as compared to Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin. He could repeat from memory all the 12 books of Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is by John Milton, and at the age, it is epic basically. At the age of 25, he wrote his essay on poetry in general and on Milton as poet, man, and politician in particular. So he was only 25 years age. He wrote his essay on the poetry in general, and his essay was on the Milton, and he described Milton as poet, as man, and politician. Okay, he wrote History of England, so he was also interested in writing something related to the history. That is why he wrote History of England. Okay, at the end we have Matthew Arnold, 1822 to 1888, and beside being a poet, Matthew Arnold was a prose writer of a high order. He was also a great literary as well as a social critic. Like Carlyle and Ruskin, he was vehement critic of his age. Vehement means fierce critic, excited, emotional critic of his age. He used to criticize the novelist and the prose writers of his own age. He was not only a literary person, but he was also a social critic. And in the when you will study that subject, that is literary criticism, so you will also study about him as a critic. His works include On Translating Homer, The Study of Celtic Literature, Essays in Criticism, Culture and Anarchy. I would like to conclude this lecture by saying that the early Victorian prose is in keeping with the energetic temperament of the time. An expansive energy seems to be the characteristics of whole period, displaying itself as freely in literature as in the development of science, geographical exploration, and the rapidity of economic change. So Victorian prose also kept up with the energetic temperament of that time because everything was changing. There were development taking place in social, political, and economic life. There was scientific revolution at that time, industrialization. So as a result, because of the new subjects and the topics, the Victorian prose writers, Victorian novelists, and Victorian poets, they had just wrote this on this subject, and they had produced masterpieces. That's all.